A woman finished her nursing shift, walked across a hospital parking lot, and got into her car. She never made it home, and for 13 long, agonizing years, nobody could explain what had happened to her or why. The truth that eventually surfaced was so chilling, so unexpectedly savage in its randomness, that even seasoned investigators who had spent decades working homicide cases struggled to fully process what they were looking at. Angela Diane Reeves was born on September 4, 1979, in Clarksville, Tennessee, a mid-sized city nestled along the Cumberland River, the kind of place where people still wave at their neighbors and leave their doors unlocked during the day. She was the second of 3 children born to Robert and Marlene Dorsey, a retired postal worker and a school teacher respectively, and from the very beginning, Angela had a way of lighting up every room she walked into. Her mother would later describe her as the one who held the family together, a phrase that sounds like the kind of thing grieving people always say. But in Angela's case, everyone who knew her agreed it was simply plainly true. Growing up in Clarksville, Angela was the sort of student who never seemed to struggle in any direction. She was warm but disciplined, kind but decisive, and she seemed to understand from a young age exactly what she wanted from the world. In high school, she was a member of the debate team, sang in her church choir at Grace Baptist Church every Sunday, and spent her summers volunteering at a local food pantry that distributed meals to families in the lower-income neighborhoods east of downtown. Her teachers described her as unusually empathetic for someone her age, someone who genuinely noticed the people around her and acted on what she observed, rather than looking away. She graduated from Northeast High School in 1997 with honors and enrolled at Austin Peay State University the following fall, where she studied nursing. Her friends from those college years remember her as someone who never seemed to doubt what she was put on earth to do. She wanted to help people. It was that simple and that complete. Angela graduated with her nursing degree in 2001 and was hired almost immediately at Clarksville Regional Medical Center, where she worked the evening shift in the emergency department. She was good at her job, genuinely, remarkably good. Her supervisors described her as one of the most composed nurses they had ever worked alongside, someone who could de-escalate a panicked family in the waiting room with the same quiet authority she used to stabilize a crash patient in a trauma bag. Her colleagues adored her. In the break room, she was the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and brought homemade sweet potato pie to the holiday potluck. In the hallways, she was the one who took the time to learn the names of every regular patient, every orderly, every custodian she passed. She had been at the hospital for nearly a decade by the time of her death, and in that time, she had become exactly the sort of nurse that every emergency department needs and rarely gets to keep, the kind who shows up fully, every single shift, and gives something real. In 2003, Angela married Marcus Reeves, a long-haul truck driver she had met at a church social organized by a mutual friend from the choir. Marcus was a big, steady, quiet man with a broad laugh and a deep respect for the value of honest work. He ran routes along the I-40 corridor, hauling freight between Nashville, Memphis, and Little Rock, and he came home smelling of coffee and diesel fuel and road miles. They bought a modest house on Daytona Drive in the Songo neighborhood of Clarksville, and by 2006, they had 2 children, a son named Deshaun, who was 4 years old in the spring of 2010, and a daughter named Brianna, who had just turned 2. Their life was not glamorous or easy. Marcus was away for stretches of 3 and 4 days at a time, and managing the household fell largely on Angela's shoulders. The money was always a little tight. There were credit card balances, a mortgage payment that seemed to grow while their savings did not, the relentless monthly cost of daycare for 2 small children. There were arguments, as there are in every marriage under financial stress, and some of them were sharp enough that neighbors on Daytona Drive could hear raised voices through the walls. But by all accounts from people who knew them well, friends from church, neighbors, Angela's colleagues at the hospital, they were a normal family doing their best, which was all anyone could ask. Thursday, March 11th, 2010, started like any other workday for Angela Reeves. She woke at 7 in the morning, made breakfast for Deshaun and Brianna, oatmeal with brown sugar, the usual, dropped them off at the daycare center on Providence Boulevard, and came home to get a few hours of sleep before her evening shift. Marcus was out of town. He had left 2 days earlier on a scheduled run to Memphis and was not expected back until Friday night. Before he left on Tuesday morning, the 2 of them had argued about a credit card bill that had come in higher than expected, A balance Marcus had run up on tools and road supplies that he had promised to pay down before the next statement. It was not a violent argument, not even an especially heated one by the standards of any stressed-out household. It was the kind of disagreement that millions of couples have every single day and forget about entirely by the following week. But it happened, and in the months that followed, that argument would be remembered and repeated and reframed in ways that would alter the course of an innocent man's life. Angela arrived at Clarksville Regional Medical Center at 2:55 p.m. for the start of her 3 to 11 shift. Her badge was swiped at the ER entrance at exactly that time, a detail confirmed by hospital security logs that investigators would later pull and examine in minute detail. For the next 8 hours, she worked a full and demanding shift in the emergency department, alongside 2 other nurses and a rotating cast of physicians and residents. It was a busy Thursday evening. A multi-car accident on I-24 produced a cluster of patients in the early hours of the shift, and a respiratory case in the late evening required sustained attention. A colleague named Patricia Odom, who worked alongside Angela through most of that shift, would later tell investigators that nothing had seemed unusual. Angela had been her normal self, professional, focused, a little tired maybe, but nothing that stood out or gave anyone pause. They had eaten together in the break room around 7, split a bag of pretzels, and talked for about 20 minutes about Patricia's upcoming vacation to Myrtle Beach. At 10:52 in the evening, Angela swiped her badge at the ER exit, clocking out for the night. That timestamp would become one of the most significant data points in the entire investigation. The hospital security cameras captured Angela walking through the ER exit at 10:53 p.m., dressed in blue scrubs, a navy zip-up jacket, and white sneakers, her tote bag slung over one shoulder. She crossed the main lobby, pushed through the exterior doors into the cold March air, and walked toward the employee parking structure on the hospital's south side. The camera at the parking structure entrance recorded her entering through the gate on foot at 10:55 p.m. That was the last image anyone had of Angela Reeves alive. At 11:47 p.m., Patricia Odom sent Angela a text message asking if she had gotten home safely. They had a loose, informal habit of checking in with each other after late shifts, the kind of small gesture that emerges between colleagues who share the particular bond of emergency department work. The message showed as delivered, but was never read. At 12:30 in the morning, Angela's mother, Marlene Dorsey, tried calling her daughter's cell phone after waking from a restless sleep and finding herself, for reasons she could not explain, unable to stop thinking about Angela. She got no answer. She told herself Angela had probably fallen asleep with her phone on silent and tried to push the worry away. At 6:15 the next morning, a construction crew working on a resurfacing project along Old Trenton Road, a rural 2-lane highway about 4 miles northeast of the hospital, flanked on both sides by stretches of scrub timber and open farmland, found a 2007 silver Honda Civic parked halfway on the gravel shoulder at the edge of the road. The engine was still running. The driver's door was standing open. The headlights were on. There was nobody inside. The construction crew called 911 at 6:22 in the morning. Montgomery County Sheriff's deputies arrived at Old Trenton Road within 20 minutes and quickly confirmed through the vehicle registration that the car belonged to Angela Reeves, a resident of the Sango neighborhood. Her tote bag was on the passenger seat, neatly placed as if she had set it down for a moment. Her phone was on the center console, still locked, the screen dark, battery at 12%. Her wallet was in the bag, undisturbed, with her driver's license, her hospital ID, and her debit card all still in their slots. There was no sign of forced entry to the vehicle. The deputies elevated the call immediately and notified the Clarksville Police Department, which assumed primary jurisdiction over the investigation. Marlene Dorsey received a call from Angela's daycare center at 8:10 in the morning asking why Deshawn and Brianna had not been dropped off. Angela had never missed a morning drop-off without calling ahead. That was when the alarm truly, viscerally went off in the family. Within the hour, Marlene had driven to her daughter's house on Daytona Drive and found it locked and empty, reached Marcus on his cell phone somewhere outside of Jackson, Tennessee, and called the Clarksville Police Department to file a missing persons report. The responding officer, following departmental protocol that required an adult to be missing for at least 24 hours before a full investigation could be initiated, initially logged the report as a welfare check. It would be upgraded to a critical missing persons investigation by noon. a delay that Angela's family would find difficult to forgive in the years to come, and one that critics of the department would point to repeatedly in subsequent reviews of how the case had been handled. Marcus Reeves turned his truck around and drove back to Clarksville in under 4 hours, pushing the legal speed limits the entire way. By early afternoon on Friday, March 12th, he was at the police department, visibly shattered, doing everything that was asked of him, providing his cell phone for examination, submitting to a voluntary interview, handing over his trucking company's dispatch log so investigators could verify his location. The department confirmed through the company's onboard GPS records and a series of time-stamped fuel station receipts that Marcus had been in and around Memphis from Monday through Thursday. He had been 320 miles away when Angela clocked out of the hospital. He had not been home since he left on Tuesday morning. His alibi was documented, time-stamped, and entirely corroborated. A search of the area around Old Trenton Road, conducted through that Friday and into the weekend with the help of volunteer search teams, turned up nothing encouraging. The roadside grass was dry and hard. It had not rained in several days and produced no useful footprints. There was no blood at or near the car, no indication of a physical struggle on the road surface itself. Inside the car, forensic technicians found a partial handprint on the driver's side door frame that did not belong to Angela, as well as a faint transfer stain on the driver's headrest that was bagged and sent to the state crime lab for analysis. Cadaver dogs were brought in and conducted a wide perimeter search through the surrounding fields and tree lines, but found no scent trail that led to a consistent location. The dogs alerted briefly at 2 points in a ditch line about 100 yards east of where the car had been found, but subsequent excavation of the area produced nothing. Angela's body was discovered 9 days later, on March 21, 2010, by a deer hunter exploring a wooded tract along Ringgold Road, approximately 6 miles from where her car had been found abandoned. She was partially concealed beneath a heavy bed of fallen branches and dead leaves, in a shallow depression set back roughly 40 feet from the road, screened from view by a dense stand of young cedars. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with repeated impacts from a hard, irregular object, possibly a rock or a heavy tool. She had significant defensive wounds on both hands, cuts and abrasions on her palms and fingers, evidence that she had fought back against her attacker with everything she had. The medical examiner's report further noted that biological material, skin cells, had been collected from beneath the fingernails on her right hand, the result of her scraping her attacker during the struggle. Those cells were carefully packaged, labeled as evidence item number CR10 DO3110311, and transferred to Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, evidence storage on March 27, 2010, and there they would sit, in a climate-controlled storage room among hundreds of other evidence bags from dozens of other cases, untouched and unexamined, for 13 years. The early investigation moved with the urgency that a murdered nurse and mother of 2 demanded, but it quickly ran into the kinds of walls that cold cases are made of. Detectives canvassed the hospital thoroughly, interviewing every employee who had worked Angela's shift, reviewing every second of security footage from every camera the facility had. They identified 17 people who had been in the ER waiting room during her shift that evening, and tracked down 13 of them for in-person questioning. None produced a lead that went anywhere. The partial handprint from the car door frame was processed and entered into the automated fingerprint identification system. It came back with no match in the database. Investigators subpoenaed Angela's phone records and found nothing that raised immediate alarms. Routine calls to her mother, her sister who lived in Nashville, several close friends from church, and the expected frequency of calls to Marcus during the week he had been on the road. There were no messages from unknown numbers, no indication of a secret relationship, a hidden conflict, or any contact with anyone who fell outside the ordinary radius of her life. Her social media presence was minimal and entirely ordinary. She used Facebook occasionally, birthday posts, church fundraiser announcements, photographs of the children on holidays, and there was nothing there that suggested a threat, a dispute, or a warning sign that anyone had failed to act on. The stain from the driver's headrest was processed at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Laboratory and returned a complicated result. The biological material was almost certainly saliva, very likely the victim's own, possibly transferred when her head made contact with the headrest during the attack or during transport. The analysis produced no foreign DNA profile. Investigators were left, forensically speaking, with the defensive wound evidence logged under Angela's fingernails, sitting in storage at the sheriff's office, and the unmatched partial handprint. In the absence of a clear physical lead pointing to any specific person, the investigation began to drift in the direction most investigations drift when they have no obvious suspect, toward the people closest to the victim. On the surface, Marcus Reeves had an airtight alibi. His truck's onboard GPS system placed him at a truck stop rest area outside Jackson, Tennessee at 10:30 p.m. on the night of Angela's disappearance, more than 200 miles from Clarksville. He had paid for fuel in Memphis at 4017 that afternoon using his company card, and a receipt showed he had eaten dinner at a diner off I-40 at 8:44 p.m. No part of the documentary record placed him anywhere near his wife on the night she died. No part of it suggested he had any physical role in what happened to her, but investigators found other things, small things that, in the absence of a better explanation, began to accumulate into something that felt, to certain detectives, like a picture worth pursuing. A neighbor named Daryl Hicks told detectives he had overheard Marcus and Angela arguing in the driveway on an evening in January. He could not make out the words he said, but the tone had been heated and Marcus had slammed the truck door hard when he left. Several people from the church mentioned, when pressed, that Marcus had seemed withdrawn and tense in recent months, and that Angela had confided to at least one close friend that things at home had been difficult. A review of the couple's banking records revealed that Marcus had taken a $400 cash advance from a credit card 10 days before Angela's death, which he told investigators he had used for road expenses on a long-haul trip. He had no receipts to prove it. He had used the money at a truck stop on the outskirts of Little Rock, he said. But the truck stop's card readers had been down that day, and he had paid cash. There was no way to verify the story. None of this was evidence of murder. None of it was remotely close. It was the kind of circumstantial noise that exists in the background of any working-class marriage under financial pressure, the kind of detail that is present and forgettable in the hundreds of thousands of households where no crime ever occurs. But it was enough, in the hands of investigators who had no other viable suspect, who felt the weight of a community's grief and the department's institutional need for resolution, to build a theory. And once a theory takes hold in an investigation, it is remarkably difficult to dislodge. By late spring of 2010, the investigation had quietly, without any official announcement, narrowed its focus to Marcus Reeves. In June, detectives brought him in for an extended interview that stretched across 2 days and totaled 11 hours of recorded questioning. Marcus answered every question. He went over his timeline again and again. He described his relationship with Angela in detail, acknowledged the financial stress, acknowledged the argument before he left, and maintained without wavering that he loved his wife, that he had no reason to want her dead, and that he had been hundreds of miles away when she was killed. He cried during portions of the second session. He asked more than once when investigators were going to start looking at whoever had actually done this. He did not have an attorney present for the first day of questioning because, he later said, he was a man who had done nothing wrong and could not conceive of why he would need one. On June 19, 2010, Marcus Reeves was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution's theory, never stated plainly in the charging documents but clearly implied in the investigative logic, was that Marcus had arranged or contracted the killing of his wife before, departing on his Memphis run, using the trip to establish distance and an alibi. It was a theory that required the imagination to fill in an enormous number of blanks. An unknown co-conspirator who had agreed to murder a woman for reasons that were never specified, who had executed the crime with apparent skill and left almost no physical evidence, and who would then vanish completely from the investigation without a single trace, tip, or connection to anyone in Angela's life or Marcus's. The case against Marcus Reeves, measured by the standards that a first-degree murder prosecution should meet, was extraordinarily thin, but the arrest was made. The charges were filed, and Marcus was transported to the Montgomery County Jail, where he was held without bond. He could not afford a private defense attorney. His family pooled what resources they had, but the fees for a qualified criminal defense lawyer in a capital-eligible murder case ran well beyond anything they could realistically raise. Marcus was appointed a public defender named Gerald Amos, a capable and conscientious attorney who was simultaneously managing 41 other active cases in the county system and did not have the investigative resources, the private investigators, the forensic consultants, the time, to mount the kind of rigorous pre-trial challenge the case demanded. The months stretched into years. Pre-trial motions were filed and argued. Hearings were scheduled and postponed. The prosecution indicated it was still developing its case. Marcus sat in the Montgomery County Jail and waited. He spent 3 years and 2 months there. During that time, Deshawn and Brianna were placed in the care of their grandmother, Marlene Dorsey, who rearranged her retirement to become, at 62, the primary caregiver for two very young children who had lost their mother to violence and their father to the cage of an accusation. Marcus lost his commercial driver's license, which under federal regulations could not be maintained by someone facing a felony charge. He lost his trucking job. He lost the house on Daytona Drive when the mortgage payments stopped coming and the bank moved through foreclosure. His family stood by him publicly, but privately the fractures were real. The kind of doubt that settles into people when they cannot fully access the truth. When the official story is the only story anyone with authority is telling, some of his relatives began to wonder, quietly and guiltily, whether they had truly known Marcus at all. That quiet fracture may have been the most insidious damage the false accusation caused. Not to Marcus's freedom, which was devastating enough, but to the web of trust that had held his life together. In August 2013, the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office announced that it was dropping all charges against Marcus Reeves. The official language cited insufficient evidence to proceed. The announcement was brief, bureaucratic, almost entirely invisible to the general public. There was no press conference, no apology, no formal acknowledgement of what more than 3 years in a county jail cell had done to a man who had committed no crime. Marcus walked out of the Montgomery County Jail on a Tuesday afternoon carrying the clothes he had been arrested in and a plastic bag containing a wallet, a watch, and a paperback novel someone had given him to read. His children, now 7 and 5 years old, were waiting with Marlene in the parking lot. Brianna, who had been a toddler when he was arrested, did not fully recognize him. She had to be reminded gently that this was her father. "I lost everything," Marcus would say in a 2016 interview with a local Clarksville television station, one of the few times he spoke publicly about what had been done to him. "My wife was gone. Then they took me away from my kids. Then they let me go and acted like nothing happened. 3 years. 3 years of my life. My kids grew up without a father because the police decided they needed someone to blame, and I was the easiest person to point at. Nobody ever said they were sorry. Nobody ever came to me and said we were wrong, nothing. They just opened the door and let me out." Detectives also spent considerable time investigating Angela's professional life for any possible threat that may have originated from the hospital itself. The emergency department, by its nature, brings nurses into close and sometimes volatile contact with patients experiencing some of the worst moments of their lives. Patients who are frightened, in pain, intoxicated, or mentally unstable. Investigators reviewed every incident report Angela had filed or been named in over her 9 years at the hospital, looking for any patient interaction that might have escalated, any complaint that could have generated a grievance, any moment where a boundary had been crossed in a way that stuck. They found 14 incident reports spanning her career, most involving routine workplace documentation, a patient who had become verbally aggressive during a triage wait, a family member who had disputed discharge instructions, a minor medication error that had been self-reported and reviewed. None of them pointed toward anything threatening. None of the individuals named in those reports appeared elsewhere in the investigation. The hospital itself cooperated fully, turning over every record that was requested, and the administrators expressed sincere and documented shock at what had happened to a member of their staff. Investigators also looked carefully at whether Angela had been followed, surveilled, or approached in any way in the weeks before her death. Whether anyone who knew her had noticed anything unusual, any car parked outside the house on Daytona Drive that shouldn't have been there, any unfamiliar person who had appeared more than once in her daily routine. Her neighbors were interviewed. Her church friends were interviewed. The staff at the daycare center on Providence Boulevard, which Angela visited twice each weekday, were interviewed. Nobody had noticed anything. Nobody could describe a person who had seemed out of place. Troy Saunders had been watching Angela Reeves for months, showing up near her workplace on at least 6 documented occasions, and he had managed to do it in such a way that left not a single witness who had registered his presence as alarming. He was careful in the specific way that people who have done this kind of thing before, the watching, the following, the waiting, tend to be careful. He knew how not to be noticed. With Marcus Reeves released and the charges formally dropped, the murder of Angela Reeves became, in the bureaucratic language of law enforcement, an open and unsolved homicide. The case file was transferred to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit, a designation that, in practical terms, meant it was placed on a shelf and reviewed whenever someone had the time and the funding to look at it, which in Montgomery County in 2013 was not often. The cold case unit consisted of a single part-time detective dividing his attention between 6 unresolved homicide files dating back to 1994. Angela's case joined the stack. The years passed. Angela's children grew up in their grandmother Marlene's house on Crossland Avenue, in a home filled with quiet grief and deliberate love. Deshawn joined the middle school basketball team, then the high school team, and by 2020, he was being recruited by small colleges. Brianna took piano lessons, then dropped piano for art, and then discovered she had a talent for both. Marlene kept a photograph of Angela on the mantelpiece in the living room, a studio portrait taken at Easter 2009. Angela in a yellow dress, her smile the specific, unguarded smile of someone who has no reason not to smile. And on the anniversary of Angela's death every March, the family gathered at Grace Baptist Church for a small memorial where people who had loved Angela could sit together and say her name out loud. Marcus rebuilt slowly, painfully, the way men rebuild when something foundational has been taken from them. He eventually regained his commercial driver's license and found work with a regional freight company operating out of Nashville. He reconnected with Deshawn and Brianna across the awkward geography of what had been done, attending school events, making phone calls, showing up consistently over years until the strangeness of his presence gave way to something more ordinary. He was never quite the same, people who knew him said. Some essential ease had been removed from him, some baseline trust in the world's basic fairness. And it never fully came back. He had learned, at enormous personal cost, that the system designed to protect people like him could turn on those same people without much evidence and without meaningful consequence. Back at the hospital where Angela had worked, a small memorial plaque had been installed in the ER break room in 2011 at the request of her former colleagues. Patricia Odom moved to another hospital in 2014, but kept Angela's phone number saved in her contacts for years afterward. She could not explain why exactly. It just felt like the right thing to do, like a small private refusal to fully let go. For all intents and purposes, Angela Reeves's murder appeared to be heading for the permanent archive of American cold cases, those thousands of deaths that the system investigated, failed to solve, and quietly absorbed into its filing cabinets without further comment. It might have stayed there forever. But in the fall of 2022, something changed. In September 2022, the Clarksville Police Department received a grant allocation from the Tennessee Office of Criminal Justice Programs, designated specifically for cold case reinvestigation. The funding had been made available through a statewide initiative prompted, in part, by the growing body of evidence that advances in forensic DNA technology, particularly the expanding coverage of the CODIS database and the development of more sensitive analysis methods, were making previously unworkable cold cases newly viable. The department assigned the funds to a detective named Sandra Price, a 12-year veteran of the homicide unit who had specifically requested the cold case assignment. Sandra Price was methodical in the particular way that distinguishes effective cold case investigators from those who simply go through the motions. She did not go looking for drama or for opportunities to second-guess her predecessors. She went looking for things that had not been done, evidence that had been collected and never analyzed, leads that had been logged and never followed, connections that had never been made because the original investigation had tunneled too quickly toward a single theory and stayed there. Her approach to each file was consistent. Read the original investigation report in full, make a comprehensive list of every piece of evidence collected and every test that had been run, and then ask a single simple question. Is there anything here that technology can now answer that it could not answer before? She opened Angela Reeves's file in the first week of November 2022. She spent 2 full days reading through it. The original detective's reports, the crime scene photographs, the medical examiner's findings, the extensive documentation of the Marcus Reeves investigation, and its eventual quiet collapse. She made her list. When she reached the medical examiner section on physical evidence recovered from the body, she came to a notation that stopped her cold. The notation read, "Subungual skin cell scrapings recovered from right hand digits 2, 3, and 4. Sample logged as evidence item number CRT 19031147, transferred to MCSO evidence storage 03627/2010. Sandra Price pulled up the evidence storage log for the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office and searched for item number CRCO11031147. It was still there. Checked in on March 27, 2010. Never checked out. never submitted to any laboratory, never analyzed. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she requested a physical review of the evidence storage room to confirm the bag was intact and the chain of custody unbroken. It was. In 2010, the department had been running a significant backlog of unprocessed biological evidence items, a problem that was common to underfunded law enforcement agencies across the country in that era, and had triaged its lab submissions to prioritize active cases where a suspect was already in custody. Angela's case, once Marcus Reeves had been arrested, had been deprioritized under the assumption that the prosecution would move forward without needing additional DNA. When the charges were dropped and the case went cold, no one had looked back to the biological evidence. There had been no system, no protocol, no flag in the file that said the sample was never tested. It had simply been stored and forgotten. Sandra Price submitted evidence item CR10, SIRDU 1147, to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Laboratory on November 18, 2022, with a rush designation and a cover memo explaining the circumstances. The lab confirmed receipt 3 days later and placed the sample in the processing queue. Sandra Price went back to her desk and told herself not to expect anything. She had worked enough cold cases to know that most biological evidence samples recovered from outdoor scenes in 2010, after 12 years in storage, came back degraded or too sparse for a usable profile. She had learned not to build her hopes on things that weren't yet real. She hoped anyway. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Crime Laboratory returned its results on February 7, 2023. The news was better than Sandra Price had allowed herself to expect. The skin cell sample from beneath Angela Reeves's fingernails had yielded a complete male DNA profile, all 13 CODIS loci present and fully readable. The sample had been extraordinarily well preserved, a product of the cold night temperatures during the period when Angela's body was exposed outdoors, combined with the careful, professional handling of the original medical examiner's team, who had bagged her hands at the scene before transport in a practice that was standard protocol but not always followed. Someone, 13 years ago, had done their job exactly right. Because of that, the evidence survived. The profile was uploaded to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, the national database that holds the genetic profiles of millions of convicted offenders and arrestees across all 50 states. On February 9, 2023, 47 minutes after the upload, the system returned a hit: the DNA under Angela Reeves's fingernails, the DNA she had scraped from her killer's skin in the last moments of her life, fighting back with everything she had in the dark on a wooded hillside in Montgomery County, Tennessee, belonged to a man named Troy Saunders, 44 years old at the time of the match, currently residing in Adams, Tennessee, a small town in Robertson County, approximately 30 miles southeast of Clarksville, employed as a floor associate at a hardware and building supply store, married since 2017. A stepfather to 2 children from his wife's previous relationship, Troy Saunders had been added to the CODIS database in March 2019 following a guilty plea to aggravated assault in a Robertson County criminal case involving a violent altercation with a neighbor. The conviction had resulted in 2 years of supervised probation and a mandatory DNA collection under Tennessee's offender profiling statute. That single felony conviction, seemingly minor in the larger ledger of his history, had placed his genetic profile in the national database, and that database had reached back 13 years, across hundreds of miles and an entire lifetime of concealment, and produced a name. Sandra Price received the match notification at 9:14 in the morning. She stared at the screen for a long time without moving. Then she picked up her phone and called the district attorney's office. Troy Saunders was born on October 22, 1978, in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, the younger of 2 sons in a household that was unstable in the ways that leave marks. His father left when Troy was 6 years old. His mother struggled with alcohol dependency through most of his childhood and into his adolescence. By the time Troy was 17, he had been arrested twice, once for shoplifting from a hardware store and once for a physical altercation at his high school that put another student in the hospital with a broken nose and 2 fractured ribs. He dropped out before finishing 11th grade and spent his early 20s cycling through low-wage manual labor jobs, minor criminal incidents, and short-lived relationships that tended to end badly. In 2001, he served 18 months in a Kentucky State Correctional Facility after pleading guilty to a robbery charge involving the theft of cash from a small grocery store. He was released in 2002 and relocated several times over the following years, before settling in Montgomery County, Tennessee, around 2005. What nobody knew, what only became clear in the months following his arrest, as investigators went back through his history with the benefit of hindsight and the motivation that a murder charge provides, was that Troy Saunders had a consistent and documented pattern of fixating on women he encountered in professional or service settings. He did not pursue these women in normal ways. He watched them. He tracked their routines. He reappeared in their lives without invitation, in ways that made them feel unsafe, but that fell in each individual instance just short of the threshold that would prompt law enforcement to take serious action. His former girlfriend from a 2007 relationship filed a police report in April 2008 describing what she called stalking behavior after she broke up with him, repeated uninvited appearances at her workplace, surveillance of her home from a car parked in the street, messages relayed through mutual acquaintances asking if she had reconsidered. The report had been taken, logged, assigned a case number, and never followed up on. Troy had not been charged with anything. In 2009, a separate woman filed for a civil restraining order against him in Clarksville after she reported that he had followed her home from a grocery store on 2 separate occasions within 3 weeks. A judge granted the restraining order. Troy violated it once, appearing near the woman's apartment complex in violation of the exclusion zone, and was issued a fine. The matter was then closed, the restraining order allowed to lapse, and the incident absorbed into the same unread archive where the 2008 complaint already sat. In November 2009, Troy Saunders came into Clarksville Regional Medical Center's emergency department on a Thursday evening with a laceration on his left forearm. A clean cut he said he had sustained at work while handling sheet metal. The intake nurse processed his arrival. The nurse who triaged him, assisted with wound preparation, and provided care during the treatment process was Angela Reeves. Investigators, working backward from the DNA match with the methodical discipline of people who now knew exactly who they were looking for, established through hospital records that Troy had been in Angela's section of the ER for approximately 90 minutes on the evening of November 13, 2009. They then interviewed everyone in Troy's immediate circle at the time, former coworkers, neighbors, casual acquaintances, and a picture emerged that was chilling in its specificity and its familiarity. He had talked about a nurse at the hospital to at least 2 people in the weeks following that visit. He described her as beautiful, said she had been kind to him, patient with him, that she had made him feel like he mattered. One acquaintance, a man named Bobby Crane, who had worked alongside Troy at a regional warehouse, told investigators that Troy had mentioned going back to the hospital to see if she was working at some point in December 2009. He had not thought anything of it at the time. He assumed Troy had a harmless crush on a woman who had been nice to him when he was hurt. But it was not harmless. Cell tower records from the period between November 2009 and March 2010, records that had been preserved under a litigation hold originally tied to the Marcus Reeves case and which therefore still existed when Sandra Price went looking for them in 2023, placed Troy Saunders' phone in the vicinity of Clarksville Regional Medical Center on at least 6 separate evenings, all of them evenings when Angela Reeves was scheduled to work the 3 to 11 shift. The hospital parking structure security camera system recorded over its footage on a 30-day cycle, and any images that might have captured Troy watching from a car in those months were long gone. But the phone data was not gone. It had been sitting in a carrier's archive for 13 years, preserved under a legal hold that had been entered for a prosecution that never happened. And now it told a story that the original investigators had never thought to look for. On the night of March 11, 2010, Troy Saunders drove to Clarksville Regional Medical Center and parked near the employee parking structure. He knew which shift Angela worked. He knew approximately when she would walk out. He had been watching long enough to know her car, to know her path. When Angela crossed the parking lot after clocking out and approached her vehicle, he was there. The precise sequence of events that followed, whether he forced her into the car at that point, whether she drove under duress, whether he drove the car himself, was never fully reconstructed by investigators. What the evidence established was that Angela's car traveled from the hospital to Old Trenton Road sometime in the window between 11 p.m. and midnight, and that at some point on that dark rural road, Troy Saunders attacked her. She had fought back, hard, desperately, with the specific ferocity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. She had scraped his skin. She had left the only evidence that would ultimately matter. He killed her. He carried her body into the woods off Ringgold Road and concealed it under branches and leaves. Then he drove away. He went home. He slept. He went to work the next morning. He collected his next paycheck. He moved to Robertson County eventually, married a woman named Denise, became a stepfather, and kept living his life for 13 years while the family he had destroyed tried to survive the wreckage. On February 14, 2023, Valentine's Day, officers from the Clarksville Police Department and the Robertson County Sheriff's Office executed an arrest warrant at Troy Saunders' residence in Adams, Tennessee. The arrest was made without incident. Troy was in the front yard of the house when officers arrived and offered no resistance. He showed, by most accounts, very little visible reaction when the lead detective informed him of the charges: first-degree premeditated murder, kidnapping, and criminal homicide in the death of Angela Diane Reeves of Clarksville, Tennessee. His wife, Denise, stood in the doorway of the house and watched her husband be handcuffed and walk to a waiting patrol car. Responding officers described her expression as one of complete and total incomprehension. Troy Saunders was transported to the Montgomery County Jail and held without bond. His court-appointed defense attorney entered a not guilty plea at the initial arraignment in March 2023. Over the months that followed, the prosecution assembled its case around the DNA match, which was definitive and built substantially outward from it. Cell tower records placed Troy's phone near the hospital and then along Old Trenton Road on the night of March 11, 2010. Bobby Crane provided a sworn written statement detailing Troy's comments about the nurse in the months before the murder. A review of vehicle registration history showed that Troy had owned a dark-colored GMC pickup truck in early 2010, consistent with the vehicle description provided by a gas station attendant near Old Trenton Road who had noted an unfamiliar dark truck parked near the shoulder late on the night in question, a detail that had been carefully logged in the original investigation file in 2010 and then passed over because it hadn't fit the theory that was already forming around Marcus Reeves. The original investigators had been so focused on where Marcus wasn't that they had never seriously pursued what else the evidence was telling them, faced with the weight of the case against him: the DNA, the cell data, the witness statements, the vehicle records. Troy Saunders changed course in October 2023. 8 months after his arrest, he entered a guilty plea to first-degree murder and kidnapping before the Montgomery County Court. There was no negotiated deal, no reduced charge, no sentencing concession, no agreement with the prosecution to provide information in exchange for consideration. He simply pleaded guilty. His attorney declined to make any statement explaining the decision. At the sentencing hearing held in November 2023, Troy addressed the court briefly. He offered what he called an apology, a flat, mechanical, surprisingly brief statement that the word sorry appeared in, but that conveyed nothing that a reasonable person would recognize as genuine remorse. Angela's family, seated in the gallery behind the prosecution table, received it in complete silence. Marlene Dorsey addressed the court at the sentencing hearing. She was 71 years old. She spoke for 11 minutes, standing without notes, looking sometimes at the judge and sometimes at Troy Saunders and sometimes at nothing in particular. She talked about the Easter photograph on the mantelpiece. She talked about Deshawn and Brianna, who were now 17 and 15 years old and sitting immediately beside her. The same children Angela had dropped off at daycare on the morning she died, grown now into people their mother had never gotten to know. She talked about the years she had spent wondering whether justice would ever come, and about how justice, when it finally arrived, felt smaller than she had always imagined it would, not because it wasn't real, not because it didn't matter, but because nothing, no sentence handed down, no guilty plea entered, no door closing on Troy Saunders for the rest of his life, could give her back her daughter. The judge sentenced Troy Allen Saunders to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was led from the courtroom without once looking at the family seated behind the prosecution table. In the weeks and months following the sentencing, the case produced a number of important and painful public conversations that the courtroom proceedings had not fully addressed. The most immediate concerned Marcus Reeves. Here was a man who had lost his wife to a violent stranger, and who had then been accused, arrested, and imprisoned for more than 3 years by the same system that was supposed to find the truth. He had been released without apology, without compensation, without any formal or public acknowledgement that the investigation had been conducted on a false premise, and that the cost of that false premise had been borne entirely by him and his family. In January 2024, Marcus filed a federal civil lawsuit against the city of Clarksville and the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, alleging malicious prosecution, civil rights violations under the 14th Amendment, and deliberate indifference to exculpatory evidence. The lawsuit was still pending at the time of this writing. His attorney, speaking to reporters outside the federal courthouse in Nashville, put it plainly, Marcus Reeves was victimized twice, first by Troy Saunders, and then by the people who were supposed to protect him. He lost his wife, his children's daily presence in his life, his home, his career, and 3 years of freedom, and he lost all of that because investigators chose a theory over the evidence. That debt has not been paid. The second conversation concerned the biological evidence that had gone untested for 13 years. Evidence item CR01147. The skin cells Angela had scraped from her killer during the fight for her life had been sitting in a storage bag since March 27, 2010. Had it been tested promptly, Troy Saunders might have been arrested while the cell tower records were fresh, while witnesses' memories were intact, while the trail was warm. Marcus Reeves would never have been charged. 3 years and 2 months of incarceration would never have happened. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Office issued a statement after the sentencing, acknowledging that the evidence processing backlog of 2010 had reflected a systemic resource constraint and that updated protocols had since been implemented. The statement did not mention Marcus Reeves by name. Advocacy organizations working on wrongful conviction reform noted that protocol updates, however sincerely implemented, do not restore the years taken from people who were failed before the protocols changed. The third conversation concerned Troy Saunders' history. 2 separate women had filed formal complaints against Kemp before Angela's murder. One had described stalking behavior in 2008. One had been granted a restraining order in 2009. Both complaints had been processed, recorded, and then effectively ignored. Angela Reeves had been murdered 4 months after the restraining order was allowed to lapse. Whether an aggressive, coordinated response to those earlier complaints might have interrupted the trajectory that led to her death was not possible to determine with certainty. But the question was real, and it deserved more than a bureaucratic shrug. For Sandra Price, the detective who had found the untested evidence in November 2022 and set everything in motion, the resolution of the case brought something she was careful and deliberate about not describing as satisfaction. Closure is a word people use because they need to call it something. She said in the subsequent departmental interview, "We found her did it. We got a conviction. Those things are real and they matter. But there are still 2 teenagers without a mother. There's still a man who spent 3 years in jail for something he didn't do and is still waiting for the system to acknowledge what it did to him. And there's still a woman named Angela who left work one night and never got home to her kids." Finding the truth doesn't undo any of that. It just means the truth is finally there. Angela Diane Reeves was 30 years old when she died. She was a nurse, a mother, a daughter, a friend, a choir singer, a woman who had spent her career caring for strangers at their worst moments, and who had done it every single shift without complaint and without recognition. She was the kind of person the world needs more of, and she was taken from it on a cold March night on a rural road in Tennessee by someone who had decided that her life mattered less than whatever he wanted. For 13 years, the system she trusted failed to find him. Failed, in fact, to even look for him properly, because it had been so busy building a case against the wrong man that it had never asked the most basic question. What does the physical evidence actually say? It was Angela herself who answered that question in the end, in the last moments of her life. Fighting back against someone far stronger than she was, she managed to reach out and leave a mark, to scrape skin from the hands of the man who was killing her and hold it under her fingernails until the forensic investigators arrived. She did the work that the system later failed to do. She preserved the evidence that eventually put Troy Saunders behind bars. She fought back, and 13 years later, when a methodical detective in a cold case unit opened the right file and asked the right question, that fight finally meant something. That detail, above all others, is the one that stays with you. There is something both devastating and quietly extraordinary about the fact that the case was solved not by a technological breakthrough that arrived from nowhere, not by a confession extracted under pressure, not by a sudden crisis of conscience on the part of the killer, but by a woman who refused, even in the final moments of her life, to be entirely passive. Angela Reeves did not simply endure what was being done to her on that rural road. She reached out. She grabbed hold. She preserved what could be preserved. She had spent her entire career in an emergency department doing exactly that, holding on to what mattered in the moments when everything was falling apart, stabilizing what could be stabilized, fighting for outcomes that were not yet lost. She did the same thing for herself on that dark road in March of 2010. Even when the outcome was already beyond her reach, that act of resistance, so small in the moment and so enormous in its eventual consequence, is the heart of this story. The children she left behind are growing up knowing that Tashawn and Brianna were told when they were old enough to understand it, about the DNA evidence, about what it meant, about how it got there, about what their mother had done to make sure the truth could one day be known. Marlene Dorsey made sure of it. She wanted them to know exactly who Angela was in that final moment. Not a victim, not a passive tragedy logged in a case file, a woman who fought back, who left a mark, who made certain that even in losing she did not surrender. Whatever else was taken from Angela Reeves on the night of March 11, 2010, and a great deal was taken from her and from everyone who loved her, that was not. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section. And don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.